Good afternoon and welcome to this special National Science Week session of Shape Your Future series, where we would be exploring the STEM career journeys of Australia's rising stars. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Rebecca Jordan. I'm Janice Waz. I'm a PhD researcher in wildlife biology at Western Sydney University, and I'm also part of the Catalyst program at the Academy of Technology and Engineering. As we gather from around Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we meet. I'm joining you today from Ghana land. I pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us online today. As we share and discuss our knowledge and practices, we acknowledge the deep knowledge forever embedded in custodianship of country. Before we get into this session, you would have seen that this is being recorded. This and all talks in the series will be available on the STELR YouTube channel for you to revisit anytime. There's also a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions, please drop them in there, and we will get to them towards the end during our discussion. There's also a chat function, but any questions should be in the Q&A section. Finally, you'll be sent a feedback form and a worksheet after this session to the email that you have registered with. Please let us know what worked well for you and what you might like to hear in our series next year. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Jordan to tell us how she came to be working in sustainable ecosystems.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you so much to everyone for joining in today. I'm really excited to be here, especially as part of National Science Week and all the exciting events that are happening around Australia today. I'm just going to share my screen now with you. And let me go there. Janice, can you let me know, is that the correct screen that we're seeing?
Yes, I can see your screen right now.
Wonderful, thank you. So thanks again, everyone. As Janice has mentioned, so I'm going to be talking today about trees, adaptation, and how we might help them be resilient into this really changing future that we're seeing. Extending from what Janice started with, I would also like to acknowledge the Muanina people as the traditional owners of the land that I'm calling in from today here in Hobart, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So why trees? This beautiful picture is from some fieldwork I did in north central Victoria. It's about 7 o'clock in the morning. There's been mist on the ground as we've come in. It's quiet. The sun beams through the mist and through the trees, and it's just stunning. But apart from being stunning, why are we concerned about trees? Well, along with other plants, from tiny miniature mosses to our huge Eucalyptus regnans, which is the world's largest, tallest flowering plant, trees are fundamental to our healthy ecosystems. They provide habitat and food for many organisms. They help provide clean air and clean water. And those benefits extend to all of us, including those of us living in cities. We're getting this growing understanding of the critical importance of healthy ecosystems, not just to nature, but also to us, even in cities when nature maybe feels far away. But what happens when the environment trees are growing in changes? Can they adapt and withstand that change and continue to support not only our fabulous ecosystems, but also ourselves? So I'm Dr. Beck Jordan. I'm a research scientist and conservation geneticist at CSIRO. And I am endlessly curious about the amazing variation that we have within our plant species, how that variation relates to the environment they grow in, and how we can use that knowledge to support really healthy, resilient ecosystems in a rapidly changing world. So today I'm going to start by talking a bit about the research that I do, and then I'll finish with how I got to the position I did from high school through to my current position here. So as a conservation geneticist, I'm interested in that genetic variation, that difference in DNA sequence, and how we can use it for conservation. And as I mentioned, in particular, how environment has possibly shaped that variation across the range of a species. What do I mean by that? So DNA, and altogether creating the genome, is the blueprint of all living organisms. It provides that information on not only how to build, but how to run an organism. And it's made up of that DNA sequence of those 4 letters or those 4 DNA bases, A, C, T, and G. And like our 26-letter alphabet, these 4 bases can be rearranged to create unique strings of genes and regulatory regions that create the genome and that blueprint for the organism. You can imagine that there's quite big differences between different organisms. We have a different DNA sequence to, say, a tree, but there's also a lot of variation within a species. And so this variation can create really unique differences between individuals, even within a species. So imagine we have this DNA piece of sequence. We can see that there are a lot of areas that are the same between all the individuals. But then we find some areas where there's a slight difference. They have a different base at that position. Different individuals have slightly different alleles. So they all have the same basic structure, but even within that, there's a bit of variation. We can use these variants in a number of ways in a number of different areas of science. So for example, in medicine, we might look at these differences to see if there's antibiotic resistance in bacteria or to do genetic testing for particular diseases. In forensic science, these variations are what underpins that DNA fingerprint that makes us unique and enables police and detectives to look for matches to DNA sequences found at a crime scene. We can also use it in agriculture. Some of these differences might be important for resistance to pests or for growing better in drier conditions. So we can use knowledge of these variants to help breed crops that are going to grow better in particular areas. We can also use it for conservation, which is what I'm really interested in. So again, we can use this DNA fingerprint and the unique combination to look at individuals and to identify and track and study those individuals. For example, we might use the unique fingerprint of a particular plant or tree to study how its pollen moves across the landscape by wind or by bees or by birds. How far does it actually go? We might look at it to look at how related particular animals are. For instance, platypus in waterways, how related they are, where offspring go and move. After they're born, do they stay in the same river as their parents, or do they actually move to other rivers over their lifetime? But what I'm really interested in is looking at what we call the population level. So what is a population? A population is a group of individuals of one species that interbreed. So these sort of live in the same area. An area can be quite large, especially when we're talking about trees. It could be tens or hundreds of kilometers in size, but they're a group that interbreed. They share genetic information. And why are we interested in this? Well, for trees, which I'm going to focus on today and what I predominantly study, we're not necessarily interested in preserving an individual tree in particular. Rather, we're wanting to preserve a forest, which is a whole group of trees. Within that forest, some trees are going to age, get old and die. Other trees are going to grow and replace them. So what we're interested in is protecting this whole collective to make sure that it is ongoing and sustainable into the future. So rather than being concerned about the individual variants of particular trees, what we're interested in is what is the variation in this whole population? What do they have access to that they could use to be resilient into the future? So when we're looking at these populations, what we find is that the genetic variation isn't constant across the range. So imagine we have this tree species here. It grows across hundreds of kilometers. At the southern end of the range, it's possibly in cooler, wetter conditions. At the northern end of the range, it's possibly in hotter, drier conditions. And so over time, even though it's one species, particular variants have meant, I beg your pardon, particular variants have meant that we get important genetic differences between populations over this range that make them more fit to that particular environment that they're growing in. So, for example, we might look at leaves and we might find that at that hotter end, what we get are actually thicker, smaller leaves. And these thicker, smaller leaves are better at retaining water. So under those dry conditions, it makes the trees more resilient and more able to hold on to the precious water they have. We can also look at the DNA sequence itself though. And so if we imagine we have these two alleles in part of the genome, one has a C, one has an A. And when we look at the different populations, we find that those different alleles are more common in different environments. So that C allele seems to occur more in the cool environments, and the A seems to occur more in the hot environments. What this is showing us is actually natural selection. So we've had natural selection from the environment that means that particular genotypes or particular alleles have been most fit in a particular environment, and those individuals have survived better and reproduced more. And so over time, we get these important genetic differences. So even though they're the same species, these slight variations mean that they're best able to grow in the environment they're in, and they can really utilize that environment to grow really well, which is really fantastic when your environment is steady. But what happens when the environment changes? Suddenly we have a mismatch between the environment that the trees are adapted to and most fit for and the conditions they're currently growing in. And this is especially tricky for long-lived tree species that can't move and can also take a long time to adapt because of the long generation times and that long lifetime that they have. And this is where my research comes in. How can we tackle this issue? So I'm really interested in looking at that genetic variation, those differences in DNA sequence and in the traits, and how they relate to the environment, and then how we can use that to understand how vulnerable or resilient species might be, or how we might guide conservation actions like revegetation plantings. So I've got a bit of an example here of a tree that I've worked on in the past. This is the grey box Eucalyptus microcarpa. It occurs across predominantly Victoria and New South Wales, though a little bit in Queensland and South Australia. And so to try and understand this variation in the species as a whole, but also how it varies between the populations, what I did was I went out and got leaf samples from a whole range of populations across Victoria and New South Wales. And then I looked at variation in two ways. I looked at variation in the DNA sequence itself. So I extracted DNA, got the sequence information, and looked at those particular variants and what was similar between all of those populations and what was different. I also looked at physical traits like leaves, again, collecting leaves. So these are the expression of that DNA code. So these leaves are coded by DNA. So rather than looking at the sequence itself, we can look at how that presents as a trait, which means we can look at difference in both the genotype, which is that DNA sequence, or the phenotype, which is the presentation of that, the physical trait that we see. And by then comparing between those populations, we can look to see, well, firstly, is there any difference? And then if there is difference, is it possibly related to environment? So thinking about those alleles in the example that we had earlier, we can look at how common a particular allele is or how frequent it is in a population, and that's on the y-axis, that vertical axis. And we can compare that to the environment that the trees are growing in. So that's the x-axis, the horizontal axis. And that might be, for example, temperature. And so what we can see is, say, for example, that A allele is much more common in warmer environments. And this can tell us two things. Firstly, it can be evidence that natural selection has occurred, that the environment has provided a selection pressure that means particular genotypes, particular alleles are more common in a particular environment, that they provide some sort of fitness advantage in that environment. The second thing it can tell us also is what the key environmental drivers might be of natural selection. So what are the key environmental components that are really important for that species? For some species, that might be temperature. They might be really sensitive to temperature, and so we see differences in the genetics related to temperature. For other species, they may be fairly resilient to temperature, and so we don't see a lot of variation related to temperature, but water is really important for them. They really need good access to water, and so that's how we see genetic variation associated with water. So how can we then take this information? So we have information about the variation within the species and how it relates to environment. We can take that then and think about some of the conservation challenges we have and how we can apply this information. So one example is thinking about how vulnerable a particular forest might be to climate change. So with all this information that we have information on the genetic variation that currently exists in that population, in that forest, in its current climate. We have a prediction and we have an idea of what the future climate might be at that particular site. And so using all our information, we know roughly what the genetic variation might be for that predicted future climate. And so what we can do is then compare the two. What is the variation that that forest currently has? What's the variation it might need to grow in, say, warmer climates? And what's the difference between the two? And that can give us an idea of how vulnerable or how resilient that forest might be to climate change by looking at how big that difference is or the chance that it might be able to adapt and catch up. The other thing we can do is in thinking about the active revegetation plantings that we might do ourselves and how we can incorporate this thinking into that. So if we're trying to do a revegetation planting, for example, at the cool end of a species distribution, traditionally we would have collected seed from the local area with this thinking that we've been talking about, where adaptation has occurred. Those plants in the local area are most fit to those local conditions, so they're going to be best for our revegetation planting. But we know that the environment and the climate is changing. So given that, what we can start to think about is, well, perhaps we should include some material from a slightly warmer location, or warmer again, or even from the hot end of the distribution. So in that revegetation, that population that we're creating, we have variation that is going to be able to not only grow in the current conditions, but it's also going to have some variation that's going to be really important and help them be resilient for future conditions that are coming along, which is really important when you're talking about a tree that's going to be there for 100 or 200 years. That's a lot of time that's going to be there, and there could be a lot of changes over that time. So that's a little bit about my research and what I do and how I think about using genetics to think about conserving trees. What I'm going to talk about now is how I got to this position, how I got to studying trees and studying genetics and conservation genetics in particular. And I suppose I just wanted to start by saying we can sometimes think about careers as being sort of this linear trajectory where we have an idea in high school of what we'd like to be, and so we're going to study and we're going to work and we're going to get to a particular position. And I think what I really want to share with my journey, and the key point I want to make, is my journey was certainly not a straight line, and it's had a lot of bends. But from each of those bends, I've learnt something and I bring that to what I do today. So I started in high school. I knew I wanted to do STEM. I loved STEM. I wanted to do science. I love the outdoors and I love being in the outdoors. So biology was something I was really naturally drawn to and knew I wanted to study. I also loved maths though, but I didn't do maths at university because I thought it might be a little bit dry by itself. And I'm going to come back to that. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So at high school, I studied biology and chemistry and maths. And then I went on to university to study applied science, in particular biology, as well as doing honours in genetics. And that was my first taste of this population genetics, so looking at genetic variation within a species. I also want to mention at this point some degrees are structured that honours years are actually separate years, and that's certainly for the Bachelor of Science I did, which gave me the opportunity to do my honours year at a different university. So you can actually move around and do different degrees at different universities. You don't need to stay in the one university, which can give you the option to really tailor to particular areas or particular places that might have a specialty that you're really, really interested in. Following my university studies, I worked for quite a number of years as a research assistant, predominantly in genetics and ecology. And there were a lot of different areas I worked in. So I worked in medical genetics, in fungi taxonomy, in plant taxonomy, as well as ecology, before finding work in conservation genetics again, which I found that I really loved and connected to that honours project that I'd done so many years earlier. I've also got in there and wanted to point out that I did a working holiday in between as well in the UK, and that was working in a restaurant. And I think it's really important to remember that there are a lot of skills you bring from many other areas of your life into your science and STEM careers. So even though it wasn't STEM, there was a lot of leadership, teamwork, problem solving, time management skills that I draw on today and that I still use in my work today. So don't ever underestimate the other things you do outside of your study and outside of your STEM careers that really contribute as well into what you're doing. So through this, as well as getting those broad range of skills, finding that field of conservation genetics, and I found that field that I really loved, and that's when I specialised and did my PhD and then a postdoctoral fellowship, which is the next step beyond a PhD before becoming the research scientist that I am today, with a focus on conservation, but also more broadly now, conservation generally, not just conservation genomics, but how we can think about conservation and think about how we can help support healthy, resilient, adaptable ecosystems. So when you're thinking about your journey forward and where you might go, there's two questions I'd love to put to you for you to think about. The first question is, what fascinates you? What are you naturally drawn to? What are you curious about? What do you really enjoy doing? And then the second one, what areas of work might benefit from those skills to solve their greatest challenges? And this might be far more diverse than you think. And I'm going to use the example here of ecology that I work in. So the people who work in ecology, you might imagine the types of people and the studies that they've done. The first that possibly come to mind are people like botanists, zoologists, ecologists. So people who study plants, who study animals, who study ecology more generally. But it's actually a lot more people who work in ecology. And this is the same for many other fields. The challenges that we're coming up against now are really diverse and require really diverse skill sets to answer the questions. So in addition to botanists, zoologists, ecologists, there are people like myself who are geneticists who are working in the field of ecology. I mentioned just before, maths was my favourite subject at high school, but I didn't pursue it. I have colleagues now who have degrees in mathematics, and that's how they've come to ecology. They bring their understanding of analysis and maths to figuring out, analysing the really big data sets that we have in ecology. With those really big data sets, we also have computer modelers and bioinformatics people who do coding and programming to help work with data sets that can be terabytes in size. We have people who work on the soils that underpin our healthy ecosystems. So these people could have backgrounds in chemistry or microbiology. With these big data sets, not only are we trying to understand the ecosystems as they are, but what might happen into the future. And this requires machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques. We also even have environmental economists and accountants. So as we're getting this understanding of how important our ecosystems are, we're also understanding that we need to, in businesses and in governments, to be able to understand what we have in terms of environment and what changes there might be and how we can manage those. And so we have economists and accountants who are also contributing to the field of ecology now. So coming back to those two questions, I really encourage you to think about what areas are fascinating, what do you enjoy, but then thinking about there's a really diverse range of places and areas that you could apply those skills. So don't ever feel like just because you like computer programming means you have to work exclusively in a computer-based field. There are many other fields now that require those skills. And similarly for maths or accounting or machine learning, it's really, really diverse, and it's really, really exciting to be able to draw different areas together in all these exciting challenges and interesting challenges that are coming up into the future. With that, I'll thank you so much for listening, and I hope this has been really helpful, and I will be here for the next about half an hour to answer your questions. Thanks, Janice. You're on mute, Janice, just to let you know.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for breaking down your field of research and sharing about plants with us. That was so interesting. I learned so much today about how vulnerable and the resilient species and what we could do to help them with climate change and the other effects of the environment. I'm quickly going to see if we have any questions for us right now. Also, if you have any questions that might have popped up while you were listening to this session, please drop them in the Q&A. All right, I do have one question here. All right, this question says, what's been the most interesting thing to work on until now?
Wow, the most interesting thing to work on. You know what, look, I find everything fascinating. So this is a real having to pick quite hard. But I think what was really fascinating was, in my honours degree, I looked at genetic variation in squid. And that was my first introduction to population genetics. And I found it fascinating to learn how much variation there is just within one species. And even to, at the time, simplistically think, well, something living in an ocean, everything can swim around the ocean. Surely everything just swims around the ocean and it all breeds together. But it really doesn't. There are real differences there. Different currents in the water and different areas mean that you can get these really important differences. So I found that always to me is this really special piece that I hold of it, just opening my eyes to the variation that is within our world, and really started my fascination for population genetics generally. So I'll say that, although yeah, I work on so many exciting things. It's really awesome.
How exciting.
Yeah.
We also have another question here. Mm-hmm. What may be done if a species occurs in only one environment?
That is such a great question, and it is such a big challenge, and one we're really trying to understand. Because sometimes something will grow in one environment, not because it can't withstand other environments, but because there are particular other constraints. So we have things like competition between other species that means something is growing in a particular area. But it might be that they can actually withstand climates or environments beyond what they actually grow in. So it's thinking about and looking and investigating how much can they tolerate as differences, as well as thinking about how we can possibly help that species possibly keep track with climate change. So maybe that species, if it's able to migrate across the landscape so it can keep track of the environmental envelope that it needs while climates change as well. So that's a couple of ways that we can think about, but that's such a great question, and one that we're really trying to understand more for many, many species.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have another question. Due to the fact that we need more land for agriculture, how is that going to help forests that we cut down?
Such a great question. And look, that's a really interesting, again, area that people are looking into. And so it's finding how we can balance those two components. And one of the really interesting things coming out is, as I mentioned earlier, I've sort of mentioned in cities, that healthy ecosystems are really important to us, even if we're living in cities. healthy ecosystems are also really important to agriculture. So those healthy forests and healthy patches of bush can help by contributing really great insects that might be pollinators. They might have natural enemies of, say, some of the pests, so they can help by fighting some of the pests in agriculture. So it's learning to find a balance between those two of how we can incorporate both the natural landscape and the agricultural landscape together, where it's mutually beneficial, that we can manage and keep the natural biodiversity that we have, and also in a way that helps agriculture in and of itself. So it's finding those synergies, and absolutely it's a tricky balance in the growing world we're living in.
All right, we have another comment and a question.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your talk, Rebecca. With all your knowledge of trees, do you have any tips to keep my houseplants alive?
Oh my goodness. I sometimes get asked this, and I think that's the point I say that I'm a geneticist, not a horticulturalist. I have a plant that is currently quarantined outside because I don't know what it's doing and I can't seem to keep it alive myself. So that's a little bit tricky. So I don't have any growing tips at home, but thinking about from the science point of view and thinking about, yeah, what different plants like, thinking about what your plant likes. So I've got, I've actually got around my computer, I can't show you guys, but I have a number of different plants here. And I know some like more sun, some like less sun, some like more water, some like less water. So it's learning about what that individual plant would like, what it wants its environment to be. Does it want it to be bright and sunny and hot, or does it want it to be cool and damp? And then trying to help emulate that for your plant. So find out where in the house it might like to get that right balance, and how much you need to water it. And don't forget to water them. Apparently they don't do so well. That's what I find anyway. I hope that helps. I'm not huge on houseplants, but they would be my couple of tips. What's the little environment that you're trying to create for your houseplant to help it thrive?
Okay, we do have a few more questions.
Great.
The next one is, which tree is the most interesting type of tree, according to you?
Oh, the most interesting. Oh, wow. That's such a great question. I was going to say, if you asked which was my favorite, that would be an easier one, but most interesting. I think some of the most interesting ones are the ones that occur in really extreme environments. So I'm thinking about, say, above the snow line, or in Central Australia where it's really hot and dry. So where you have plants that are needing to be able to survive in quite warm summers, but then be covered in snow and to not freeze. So, you know, all the water in their cells needs to not freeze and break so that they can survive. And similarly in deserts, where at night the temperatures can get extremely cold, and then in the day they can get extremely hot, and they have to survive everything in between. So I think some of those really show just how incredible adaptation to an environment can really be when they've found this way to withstand some of these conditions. I was out hiking recently in the snow here in Tasmania, which was amazing. And I was rugged up with all these layers and beanies and gloves, and I was looking at these trees that were just standing there covered in snow. They figured it out. And it's just incredible that they have systems that mean that they can withstand that really wide range of environments and survive, not just survive there, but thrive there. And so I think they're incredible.
That's true. We have another question. Are people doing the genetic diversity regeneration across the range of a species on mammals and birds as well as plant species?
That's a good question, and it's certainly something being thought about. I'm not really across that, so I can't speak to it too much, but there is certainly conservation genetics in animals is a really active area of research as well. I'm not quite sure about the adaptation to environment, but I certainly know there's a lot of thought that's going into things like reintroductions or captive breeding to really look at the genetic information to make sure that we're maintaining diverse populations, that those populations aren't getting inbred, they're not losing diversity, that they're maintaining diversity as we try and breed some of our most threatened species. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I have a question for you, and I'm guessing this would help the other students as well. What would you want to have told your high school self now?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, the one thing I would love, if I had my time over again, honestly, I would do a double degree in maths and biology. I had just no idea of the diversity of options that are available from any particular training or particular degree. So I really think that that's one thing I would tell my younger self, and I'd love to share with all of you, is to think really broadly. The training that you're going to undertake in high school and university is going to be able to be applied in a really wide range of areas. You'd probably be really quite surprised where you can take your skills. So I'd really encourage you to think not only about what you enjoy doing, but really think about where can I apply that in the world. And yeah, don't limit your thinking too much. Go out, explore, talk to people. It's something I did early on, and I'd really encourage others to do it. If there's someone who is doing the job that you go, wow, that job's amazing, I'd love to do it, reach out with a polite email. You'd be surprised how many people would be happy to talk to you, like we are today, about how they got there. And you might find that actually there's all these other areas that you didn't know existed. So keep your eyes and ears open to the opportunities that your training will provide.
Thank you. Another question has just come up. Does changing the genetics of a tree increase the risk of it being invasive to the environment, to be transported for adaptability, and to save a species?
Yeah, so the work that I'm doing isn't looking to change the genetics of the tree. So there are other fields that will do genetic modifications. So this is really utilising the variation that already exists there and thinking about, could we move that to other areas of the landscape to help in terms of resilience? But your question is really, really applicable as well, because it may be something that invasive would be the worst case scenario, but we can have other sort of minor impacts that may influence, say, revegetation plantings. So in moving trees from different areas of the landscape, we might end up with trees that also, they flower at a different time. So they're not there when the pollinators are there, or perhaps they're adapted to soils. So if we move them, even though we're bringing in, say, variation associated with warmer environments, they may not grow as well because the soils are really different. So it's a really great question to think about, and one that is getting a lot of thinking and a lot of research at the moment is, we know this natural variation exists, but how can we use it, and how can we use it well and effectively to make sure that we don't have those adverse effects of what you're alluding to there as well, where we're causing a disruption in the natural interactions that occur around a plant, while also increasing resilience. So yeah, there's two things there that really have to be thought about carefully. Great question.
All right, we do have someone curious in the audience now who wants to know, what's your favorite tree and why? Oh,
excellent. Thank you so much for asking that. Look, I feel a little bit cheeky. My favorite tree keeps changing. Certainly my favorite eucalypt is the white box eucalypt, which occurs in a similar area to grey box, but it's just this beautiful big woodland tree. It has these big leaves that are sort of a silvery blue grey, and these beautiful oblong gum nuts, which I just love. But I think my favorite tree is one that I found down here in Tasmania, and it's Nothofagus gunnii. It's the deciduous birch. So it's Australia's only winter deciduous species. And in autumn, you go up and all the leaves have gone red and orange and yellow, and it's just spectacular to see.
Great. The last one here that we have is there another thing that you would have become if you weren't a scientist?
Oh, if I wasn't a scientist, what would I be? Oh gosh, that's a really great question, because I think about all the other things I'd love to do and I realize they're all science things as well. You know what, the other thing I love to do, and I think the area that I would have gone into if it wasn't science, is I really enjoy working with people and helping people. So I think it would have been some sort of field where I can, help others, perhaps not STEM. And it's something, again, that's really interesting to bring in now, that some of the work I do now as I start to become a project leader is I'm still doing my science, but I'm working with other people and helping other people. So again, it's interesting the other skills that you can bring into your career. So yeah, I couldn't tell you precisely what that field would be, but it would have to do with helping others and helping, I think, people in vulnerable situations, making sure they have the support and help that they need.
All right, there's another question.
Mm-hmm.
What is another tree that you really want to see that you haven't seen yet?
Oh, a tree that I want to see that I would love to see. I don't know if anyone's seen, I don't know if we have it in this day and age, but I remember National Geographic magazines that would have this fold out of these amazing sequoia dendrons that occur in North America. These are huge, huge trees, and you'd have this photo and you can see the tree climbers as these tiny, tiny little people who are climbing up these massive, massive trees. And I would dearly love to go and see one of those trees. I think they would just be incredible, and I would be so excited to get up in the canopy and just see all the amazing habitat that that single tree provides. That I'd be super excited to see one of those.
All right, and there's also a comment from the same student saying that they have a coastal redwood in their own schoolyard.
So exciting! How beautiful!
Yeah, that's how we share and we learn, you know, we know about things around. Okay, I think that's all that we have for the questions today. Of course, if any of you have any more questions, you can always write to us. But thank you for joining us and sharing your journey with us, Rebecca. And thank you all for tuning in today. This series of talks was supported by the Victorian Challenge and Enrichment Series. Don't forget to fill out our feedback form after you leave this session. The Shape Your Future series will be continuing all this year, so you can tune in to hear from many more scientists just like you did today. All the information is available on the STELR and @C websites. Thank you once again. Thank you.